July 5, 1943. Prokhorovka, Soviet Union. Dawn broke across the rolling steppes of southern Russia, revealing a sight that would define modern warfare. As far as the eye could see, steel monsters crawled across the wheat fields. Tiger tanks, their 88mm guns capable of destroying any Soviet armor at over a mile. Panther tanks, with sloped fronts that deflected shells like rain. Ferdinand tank destroyers, rolling fortresses mounting guns that could pierce 4 inches of armor. This was Operation Citadel, Hitler's attempt to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces at Kursk, and these machines represented the culmination of German engineering dominance. Then came the sound, low at first, barely audible over the thunder of tank engines and artillery, a droning that grew steadily louder, more insistent. German tank commanders, standing in their open hatches, scanned the horizon. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What they saw made veteran crews, men who had fought from Poland to the gates of Moscow, close their hatches and pray. A formation of aircraft appeared, flying so low their prop wash kicked up dust from the ground. 40 aircraft in a tight circle, each one dark, angular, and armored like the tanks below. No graceful dive bombers these, no sleek fighters darting through clouds. These were IL-2 Sturmoviks, and they had come to kill. What followed was not aerial combat as the Luftwaffe understood it. What followed was slaughter from above, executed with mechanical precision by pilots who had learned their brutal trade in 3 years of the most savage war in human history. The German tank crews called the IL-2 the Black Death. The name was not metaphor, it was diagnosis. But the story of the Sturmovik is not one of overwhelming technological superiority or brilliant initial design. It is the story of how desperate necessity, industrial determination, and the blood of thousands of pilots transformed a flawed aircraft into the most produced military airplane in history. More than 36,000 IL-2s were built between 1941 and 1944. No other combat aircraft has ever matched that number. The IL-2 defined Soviet air power, represented Stalin's industrial will made manifest, and became the physical embodiment of how the Soviet Union ground Nazi Germany into defeat through sheer material weight and terrible sacrifice. To understand the IL-2 Sturmovik, you must first understand what it was designed to replace and why conventional thinking about ground attack aviation had failed so catastrophically in the opening years of World War II. In the 1930s, the concept of close air support remained primitive. The Spanish Civil War had demonstrated that aircraft could support ground forces, but the methods were imprecise. Bombers dropped their payloads from altitude, hoping to hit enemy positions. Fighters strafed columns with machine guns, doing little real damage. The German Junkers 87 Stuka dive bomber represented the first serious attempt to create a precision ground attack aircraft. With its distinctive inverted gull wings and screaming sirens, the Stuka could place a bomb with reasonable accuracy and terrorize enemy troops with its psychological impact. But the Stuka's success in Poland and France in 1939 and 1940 concealed fundamental vulnerabilities. The aircraft was slow, with a maximum speed of only 240 miles per hour. It was lightly armored, vulnerable to ground fire. Most critically, it was defenseless against enemy fighters. When the Luftwaffe encountered determined fighter opposition during the Battle of Britain, Stukas died in appalling numbers. The German High Command was forced to withdraw them from daylight operations over England after losing 41 aircraft in just 4 days. Soviet military observers studied these lessons carefully. The conflict with Japan on the Mongolian-Manchurian border in 1939, the Spanish Civil War, and the Winter War with Finland in 1939 and 1940 all demonstrated the need for aircraft that could survive in hostile airspace while attacking ground targets. Traditional bombers were too high and too inaccurate. Fighters lacked the armament to damage hardened targets. Something new was required, a fusion of armor, firepower, and low-altitude capability that could operate in the most dangerous airspace imaginable, the zone directly above the front lines, where every weapon from rifles to anti-aircraft cannons could reach you. The solution emerged from the design bureau of Sergei Vladimirovich Ilyushin, an engineer whose background perfectly suited him for creating a brute force weapon. Born in 1894 to a peasant family, Ilyushin had worked as a manual laborer before joining the Red Army in 1919 during the Russian Civil War. He taught himself aircraft design, rising through Soviet aviation institutes by sheer competence, in an era when technical ability could overcome almost any disadvantage of birth. By 1938, Ilyushin headed his own design bureau and was tasked with creating an armored ground attack aircraft. The challenge was immense. Armor adds weight, weight reduces speed, maneuverability, and payload capacity. Every pound of steel protecting the pilot is a pound not available for bombs or ammunition. Previous attempts to create armored aircraft had produced machines too slow and clumsy to be effective. Dmitry Pavlovich Grigorovich had designed armored biplanes in the early 1930s, the TSH-1 and TSH-2, but Soviet engines lacked sufficient power to make them viable combat aircraft. Ilyushin's innovation was radical and elegant. Instead of bolting armor plates onto a conventional airframe, he made the armor itself structural. The IL-2's entire front section, from the propeller to just behind the pilot's seat, consisted of an armored hull of riveted homogeneous armor steel designated AB1 and AB2. This bathtub of steel, weighing 780 kilograms, protected the engine, the cockpit, the water and oil radiators, and the fuel tanks. The armor ranged from 4 to 12 millimeters thick, with the cockpit canopy featuring 6 centimeters of armored glass. This was not passive protection bolted onto a frame. This was the frame. The armor carried the structural loads. The wings and rear fuselage attached directly to the armored hull, the strongest element of the entire airframe. No other aircraft had ever been designed this way. It was architecturally bold and made possible only by the power of the Mikulin AM-38 engine, a 12-cylinder liquid-cooled power plant specifically optimized for low-altitude operations. The AM-38 produced 1,680 horsepower, just barely enough to move the IL-2's nearly 10,000-pound mass through the air at useful speeds. The result was an aircraft unlike anything else flying. The IL-2 was a single-engine, low-wing monoplane of mixed construction. The forward armored section was all steel. The rear fuselage and wings were wood, covered with fabric and plywood. This combination of materials made the IL-2 possible to mass-produce even with limited supplies of strategic metals. It could be built by moderately skilled workers, assembled in factories far from sophisticated machine shops, and repaired in the field with basic tools. Armament reflected the aircraft's ground attack mission. The initial production variant, designated IL-2 Model 1941, carried two 20mm Chef-Vac cannons, or two 23mm VR-23 cannons, depending on which factory produced the aircraft. These wing-mounted guns could fire 600 rounds per minute, delivering devastating firepower against soft targets like trucks, artillery positions, and infantry concentrations. Two Shi-KAS machine guns, 7.62mm in caliber, added to the forward-firing armament. For heavier targets, the IL-2 could carry up to 600 kilograms of bombs in an internal bomb bay and on external racks. 8 82mm RS-82 rockets or 4 larger 132mm RS-132 rockets could be mounted under the wings. These unguided rockets, while wildly inaccurate, had sufficient explosive power to destroy a tank or blast apart a building with a direct hit. The psychological effect of rocket attacks, the screaming approach and devastating explosion, proved almost as valuable as the actual destruction inflicted. The IL-2 first flew on October 2, 1939, designated TSKB-55 in Ilyushin's Design Bureau nomenclature. Initial testing revealed an aircraft that was exactly what Soviet planners needed, and simultaneously revealed fundamental compromises that would haunt the type throughout its service life. The IL-2 was tough. Ground fire that would shred conventional aircraft bounced off the armored hull. The IL-2 was stable. The low-wing design and robust landing gear made it suitable for operation from rough frontline airstrips an essential characteristic given that Soviet airfield infrastructure was primitive compared to German facilities. The IL-2 was simple. Pilots with minimal training could fly it. Ground crews with basic tools could maintain it. But the IL-2 was also slow. Maximum speed topped out at around 250 miles per hour, barely faster than a Stuka and woefully inadequate compared to German fighters. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 could reach 380 miles per hour. The Focke-Wulf 4-190 exceeded 400 miles per hour. An IL-2 could not outrun anything. The IL-2 was unmaneuverable. That structural armor that made it survivable also made it sluggish. Tight turns were impossible. Rapid climbs were out of the question. The IL-2 fought in two dimensions, low and straight, because that was all it could do. Most critically, the IL-2 was defenseless from behind. The original single-seat design had no rear-facing armament. The entire back of the aircraft, from just behind the pilot's seat to the tail, was unarmored wood and fabric. A German fighter attacking from the rear had a target-rich environment. The vulnerable rear fuselage, the exposed control surfaces, and the completely unprotected pilot's back meant that German pilots quickly learned to avoid frontal attacks entirely. They simply maneuvered behind the Sturmovik and fired into its unprotected rear. This fatal flaw would be corrected, but not before thousands of pilots died. The correction came from the pilots themselves, men flying the aircraft and watching their comrades burn. Production began in March 1941 at Factory No. 38 in Voronezh. By the time Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, only 249 IL-2s had been built. Of these, a mere 70 were actually in service with frontline units. 20 of those 70 were stationed with frontier military districts that would receive the full force of Operation Barbarossa. The pilots had undergone minimal training, just enough to take off and land. Most had never fired the aircraft's weapons. Ground crews had no experience servicing the type. Tactical doctrines for IL-2 employment did not exist. The 4th Aviation Assault Regiment, equipped with IL-2s and stationed near the Soviet border, exemplified the chaos. On the morning of June 22nd, the regiment had 65 Sturmoviks. In the first 3 days of war, 10 were lost to enemy action, 19 to other causes, including pilot error, mechanical failure, and crashes during hasty evacuations. 20 pilots were killed. Within a week, the 4th had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. The IL-2's combat debut came on June 27, 19 Poloses, 41, over the Berezina River. 5 Sturmoviks attacked a German convoy of tanks and mechanized infantry. The results were inconclusive. The IL-2s survived, their armor deflecting machine gun fire as designed, but the damage they inflicted was minimal. The pilots were too inexperienced to attack effectively. The cannons, while powerful against soft targets, could not penetrate tank armor from most angles. The rockets were too inaccurate to hit moving vehicles. But German forces noticed something that would define the IL-2's reputation for the rest of the war. The Sturmoviks did not die easily. Luftwaffe fighters swarmed them, pouring fire into the armored hulls. The IL-2s absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any other aircraft. Machine gun bullets sparked off armor plate. 20mm cannon shells punched through wings and tail, but failed to bring the aircraft down. The Sturmoviks limped back to their airfields, riddled with holes, control surfaces shredded, but still flying. German pilots began calling the IL-2 the Betonflugzeug, the concrete bomber. The term captured both grudging respect for the aircraft's durability and contempt for its performance. The IL-2 could not maneuver. It could not escape. It simply absorbed damage and kept flying, a quality more associated with concrete structures than with aircraft. Then the killing began in earnest. Once German fighter pilots understood the IL-2's vulnerability from behind, they stopped attacking from the front. Standard Luftwaffe tactics evolved rapidly. German fighters would allow IL-2s to pass, then attack from the rear quarter, raking the unarmored back sections with cannon fire. Control cables were severed, Fuel tanks, located just behind the pilot and unprotected once the armor ran out, erupted in flames. Pilots, their backs to the enemy and without armor coverage, were killed in their seats. During periods of intense fighting in late 1941, IL-2 loss rates were catastrophic. 1 aircraft was lost for every 10 combat missions. Think about what that means. An IL-2 pilot who flew a full tour of duty, if such a concept even existed in the desperate chaos of 1941, had essentially zero chance of survival. The aircraft was a death sentence dressed up as armored protection. The Soviet Air Force, the VVS, lost over 4,000 aircraft of all types in the first month of hostilities. The 4th Aviation Assault Regiment, the most experienced IL-2 unit, lost 55 of its 65 Sturmoviks in the opening weeks. Factory production could not keep pace with losses. Then the factories themselves came under threat. As German forces advanced, the industrial centers that produced the IL-2 faced evacuation or capture. Factory number 38 in Voronezh dismantled its assembly lines and moved east, beyond the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombers. The relocation was industrial surgery performed under combat conditions. Machinery was loaded onto trains, workers and their families evacuated. Production stopped entirely for 2 months while factories relocated and rebuilt in the east. In this context, with the Wehrmacht advancing on Moscow, with Soviet defenses collapsing across a 1,000-mile front, with industrial production disrupted and losses mounting, Joseph Stalin sent a telegram. The message, addressed to factory managers Schenkman and Tretyakov in the autumn of 1941, contained no diplomatic phrasing, no bureaucratic softening. It was a death threat delivered through official channels. "You have let down our country and our Red Army," Stalin wrote. "You have the nerve not to manufacture IL-2s until now. Our Red Army now needs IL-2 aircraft, like the air it breathes, like the bread it eats. Schenkman produces 1 IL-2 a day, and Tretyakov builds 1 or 2 MiG-3s daily. It is a mockery of our country and the Red Army. I ask you not to try the government's patience and demand that you manufacture more ILs. This is my final warning." The telegram is worth examining for what it reveals about Soviet priorities and Stalin's leadership style. The Soviet Union was fighting for survival. The German army was 30 miles from Moscow. Leningrad was under siege. The Luftwaffe dominated Soviet skies. In this moment of existential crisis, Stalin found time to personally threaten aircraft factory managers about production rates. The phrase, "This is my final warning," meant exactly what it implied. Stalin had executed hundreds of thousands of Red Army officers for suspected disloyalty during the Great Purge. Factory managers who failed to meet production quotas could expect arrest, show trial, and execution. The threat was not subtle. The threat was not empty. Production increased. By late 1941, State Aviation Factory No. 1 in Kuibyshev, now Samara, came online after its evacuation from Moscow. This single factory would ultimately produce 11,863 IL-2s over 4 years, averaging over 7 aircraft per day while also producing MiG-3 fighters and later the IL-10, the Sturmovik's successor. Other factories joined production. The assembly process was streamlined, simplified, designed for speed rather than refinement. But increased production meant nothing if pilots kept dying at unsustainable rates. The IL-2 needed modification. The change came from an unexpected source, a letter from a frontline pilot directly to Stalin. Soviet pilots, watching comrades burn in aircraft that could survive frontal attacks but died from rear attacks, improvised their own solutions. Ground crews at frontline regiments removed the rear canopy fairing and installed machine gunners behind the pilot with minimal ammunition and no armor. These field modifications demonstrated that a rear gunner could significantly improve survival rates by driving off attacking fighters. One pilot formalized this observation in a letter to Stalin, suggesting that the IL-2 be redesigned with a proper rear gunner position. Stalin, who understood aircraft development approximately not at all but understood survival rates and propaganda value perfectly, ordered the change. The 2-seat IL-2 entered production in 1942. The modification was not subtle. The aircraft was lengthened. A rear cockpit was added behind the pilot, elevated to provide the gunner with a clear field of fire. A 12.7mm Berezin UB machine gun was mounted on a flexible mounting, allowing the gunner to engage targets in a wide arc behind the aircraft. The gunner received minimal armor protection, 13mm of steel plate, providing some protection against small arms fire, but nothing that would stop cannon shells. The addition of the second crewman and defensive armament increased weight by approximately 200 kilograms. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The bomb load was reduced from 600 to 400 kilograms to compensate. The center of gravity shifted, requiring the leading edges of the wings to be swept back 15 degrees to restore proper handling characteristics. The upgraded AM-38F engine, producing 1,750 horsepower, offset some of the performance loss. Maximum speed remained around 250 miles per hour, barely adequate but sufficient for the low-altitude environment where the Sturmovik operated. The two-seat IL-2, designated IL-2 M3 or Model 1943 in the West, first saw combat on October 30, 1942 near Stalingrad. The results were immediate and dramatic. Loss rates decreased significantly. German fighters could no longer attack from behind with impunity. The rear gunner could not guarantee survival. The IL-2 remained fundamentally vulnerable to dedicated fighter attacks, but the addition of defensive armament transformed the aircraft from a helpless target into something that could fight back. By early 1943, the 20mm Schwag-armed IL-2s faded from production, replaced entirely by the 23mm VR-23 variant. The VR-23 cannon represented a significant improvement in firepower. The Volkov-Yartsev VR-23 autocannon was designed specifically for the IL-2. Developed in 1940 by A. Volkov and S. A. Yartsev, the weapon was intended to create a gun capable of penetrating German tank armor. The original testing was performed using a Messerschmitt Bf-110 heavy fighter that Germany had sold to the Soviet Union in 1940 because no suitable Soviet aircraft existed for mounting the prototype weapon. After testing on the IL-2 in 1941, the TKB-201 prototype was accepted into service as the VR-23. The gun was 2.14 meters long and weighed 68 kilograms. It operated on the gas-operated principle, belt-fed, with a rate of fire of 600 rounds per minute. This was a high rate of fire for such a large-caliber weapon. A powerful new 23x152B cartridge was developed specifically for the V-wire. The ammunition consisted of fragmentation incendiary tracer, and armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The armor-piercing round could penetrate 25 millimeters of armor at 400 meters. This was sufficient to defeat the side and rear armor of most German tanks if the pilot could achieve the proper angle of attack. Light tanks like the Panzer II and early Panzer III variants could be destroyed from any angle. Medium tanks like the Panzer IV required attacks from the side or rear, aiming for the thinner armor around the engine compartment. Heavy tanks like the Tiger and Panther, however, were largely immune to the VR-23. Their frontal armor exceeded 100 millimeters in thickness. Side armor on the Tiger was 80 millimeters. The VR could not penetrate these surfaces at any practical range or angle. For truly armored targets, the IL-2 would need different weapons. The operational reality of IL-2 combat by 1943 revealed sophisticated tactics developed through bitter experience. Soviet pilots learned to attack in groups, typically 4 to 12 aircraft in echeloned formations. They approached targets at extremely low altitude, 20 to 50 feet above the ground, using terrain to mask their approach. The target was kept to the pilot's left, allowing the pilot to maintain visual contact while executing a shallow diving attack at approximately 30 degrees. The attack itself lasted seconds. The IL-2 would rise slightly, presenting its cannons and rockets to the target, fire a burst or salvo, then break away at ground level, using the aircraft's one advantage, its ability to fly lower than German fighters dared follow. The Sturmovik's robust landing gear and heavy construction meant pilots could literally brush the ground without catastrophic results. German fighters, lighter and more fragile, could not match this capability. Against soft targets, columns of trucks, artillery positions, infantry concentrations, fuel depots, supply trains, the IL-2 was devastatingly effective. The 23mm cannon shells would tear through unarmored vehicles with ease. The high-explosive rounds fragmented on impact, killing exposed personnel within meters of the strike. Rockets, while inaccurate, created massive blast effects that destroyed equipment and demoralized survivors. But against tanks, the IL-2 remained problematic. The cannons could penetrate light armor at close range from specific angles. The rockets, if they hit, could disable or destroy any tank. But scoring hits with unguided rockets against moving armored vehicles proved extraordinarily difficult. Experienced IL-2 pilots rarely relied on rockets against tanks, preferring to use their cannons and save rockets for the softer, larger targets. The solution to the tank problem came not from larger guns or more powerful rockets, but from a revolutionary new weapon that transformed the IL-2 from a useful ground attack aircraft into one of the most feared anti-tank platforms of World War II. The Protivotankovaya Aviabomba, designated PTAB-2.5-1.5, entered service in early 1943. The designation indicated total weight of 2.5 kilograms and an explosive charge of 1.5 kilograms. These were shaped charge bomblets, using the Monroe effect to focus explosive energy into a penetrating jet, capable of punching through armor far thicker than conventional high explosives could defeat. The PTAB was small, roughly the size of a pineapple grenade, but could penetrate up to 70 millimeters of armor. This was sufficient to defeat the top armor of every German tank in service. Tank armor is thickest at the front, where designers expect incoming fire. Top armor, which must be kept thin to control vehicle weight, is the Achilles heel of armored warfare. A shaped charge bomblet striking the top of a tank's turret or engine deck had excellent odds of penetration, and penetration of a closed tank means fire, ammunition, detonation, and crew death. The IL-2 could carry PTAB bomblets in staggering quantities. Up to 192 could be loaded in 4 external cassette dispensers, cluster munitions that released the bomblets over a target area. An additional 220 could be carried in internal weapon bays in the inner wing panels. When released, these bomblets would carpet an area approximately 70 meters long and 15 meters wide, with armor-piercing munitions that required no precision to be effective. The tactical implications were revolutionary. Previously, destroying a tank with aerial attack required scoring a direct hit with a bomb or rocket, an extraordinarily difficult feat against a moving target. With PTAB bomblets, the IL-2 pilot simply needed to fly over the general area where tanks were concentrated and release the entire load. Statistical probability ensured hits. If 40 tanks occupied a square kilometer and an IL-2 released 200 bomblets over that area, multiple tanks would be struck purely by chance. The Germans had no defense against this tactic. Tank crews could not see bomblets falling from above. They could not maneuver away from a carpet of submunitions. They could not armor the top of their vehicles sufficiently without making them too heavy to move. The PTAB transformed the IL-2 from a useful harassment weapon into a genuine tank killer. The weapon's debut came at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history and the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. Operation Citadel, as the Germans designated it, was Hitler's attempt to regain the initiative after the disaster at Stalingrad. The plan was simple in concept. Massive pincer attack against the Soviet salient centered on the city of Kursk, encircle and destroy the defending Soviet forces, and shatter the Red Army's offensive capability before it could launch its own summer offensive. The Germans assembled overwhelming force, 30 divisions, including 17 Panzer and Panzergrenadier divisions, equipped with the newest and most powerful tanks Germany could field. Tiger tanks with 88mm guns and armor that could defeat any Soviet tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Panther tanks with sloped armor and high-velocity 75mm guns. Ferdinand tank destroyers mounting guns that could penetrate 4 inches of armor at a mile. Nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns, supported by over 2,000 aircraft and the most experienced tank commanders in the Wehrmacht. Soviet intelligence knew the attack was coming. German preparations were too extensive to hide. The Soviets responded by fortifying the Kursk salient with defensive works of unprecedented depth and density. 8 defensive belts extending over 120 miles in depth, over 20,000 guns and mortars, over 3,300 tanks, nearly 3 million mines, and aircraft. Thousands of aircraft, including hundreds of IL-2s, now armed with PTAB bomblets. The battle began on July 5, 1943. German forces attacked from both north and south, attempting to cut off the salient. Initial progress was significant. German armor broke through the first Soviet defensive lines. For the first few days, it appeared Operation Citadel might succeed despite Soviet preparations. Then the IL-2s arrived. Soviet records claim that on July 7, 1943, IL-2 attacks destroyed 70 tanks from the German 9th Panzer Division in just 20 minutes, halting its advance in the Kashara region. The aircraft delivered 3 powerful attacks in groups of 20 to 30, according to Soviet staff publications. The result was the destruction or disabling of 34 tanks, forcing the Germans to withdraw the remnants of the division. Other claims were even more extraordinary. IL-2 pilots reported destroying 270 tanks from the 3rd Panzer Division and 240 tanks from the 17th Panzer Division. The most extreme claims stated that over a period of 4 hours, IL-2s destroyed 240 tanks and virtually wiped out the 17th Panzer Division. These numbers must be examined carefully. The 3rd Panzer Division entered the Battle of Kursk with 90 operational tanks, not the 270 claimed destroyed. The 17th Panzer Division had 67 operational tanks on July 1, 1943, not the 240 claimed destroyed. Even accounting for reinforcements and repairs, the claimed kills exceeded the number of tanks these divisions possessed by substantial margins. The discrepancy reveals a fundamental problem with aerial combat reporting in World War II. Pilots of all nations, operating in the chaos of combat, with visibility obscured by smoke and explosions, with split seconds to observe results before breaking away, consistently over-reported their achievements. A tank struck by cannon fire might emit smoke from damaged external equipment but remain operational. A tank hit by a rocket might throw a track, immobilizing it temporarily but not destroying it. A tank crew might abandon their vehicle after near misses, then recover it once the air attack ended. Operational research conducted during and after the war consistently found that fewer than 10% of tank losses could be attributed to air power. The vast majority of tanks were destroyed by anti-tank guns, other tanks, mines, and artillery fire. Many were simply abandoned due to mechanical breakdowns, thrown tracks, or lack of fuel, particularly in the final months of the war when German logistics collapsed. Post-war analysis of the Battle of Kursk supports this pattern. Total German tank losses in Operation Citadel amounted to 323 destroyed. The vast majority were knocked out by Soviet anti-tank guns and armored fighting vehicles, not by aircraft. First-hand accounts from German panzer crews rarely mention losses to air attack. When they do, it is occasional, not constant. The overwhelming threat came from the ground, from dug-in anti-tank guns firing from concealed positions, from Soviet tanks appearing at close range, from mines that shredded tracks and immobilized vehicles. Yet even accounting for over-reporting, the IL-2 had significant impact at Kursk. The psychological effect alone was substantial. German tank crews operated knowing that Soviet aircraft could appear at any moment, flying at treetop level, too low to be effectively engaged by anti-aircraft guns, carpeting entire areas with armor-piercing bomblets. This constant threat forced dispersion. Tanks could not concentrate in the dense formations that maximized their combat power. Supply columns had to move at night or risk destruction. Artillery positions had to be camouflaged and frequently relocated. The actual physical damage, while less than Soviet claims suggested, was not negligible. Dozens of tanks were destroyed or damaged by air attack. More critically, hundreds of support vehicles, trucks, fuel tankers, ammunition carriers were destroyed. Ground attack aircraft excel against soft-skinned vehicles, and the German offensive depended entirely on constant resupply of fuel and ammunition to keep the panzers moving. IL-2 attacks against supply columns throughout the battle area disrupted logistics, slowed the advance, and contributed to the eventual German failure to achieve breakthrough. The broader pattern of IL-2 operations throughout the war reflects this reality. The Sturmovik was most effective against soft targets and logistics. At Stalingrad, IL-2s played a major role in interdicting the German Sixth Army's aerial resupply effort during winter 1942 and 1943. They destroyed 72 Luftwaffe aircraft on the ground at the airfield of Salsk in late November 1942, striking before German fighters could scramble to defend. They shot down numerous Junkers 52 transport aircraft, slow and defenseless, attempting to deliver supplies to the encircled German forces. Against transportation networks, the IL-2 was devastating. On January 26, 1943, as the Battle of Stalingrad neared its conclusion, 2 Sturmoviks appeared over the German-held train station at Malorossiyskaya in the Tikhoretsk region. 4 trains sat exposed on the tracks, loaded with personnel, fuel, tanks, and ammunition vital to continued German operations. The 2 IL-2s attacked in succession, each making multiple passes. Deafening explosions rocked all 4 trains. A massive black plume rose into the sky. All 4 trains were destroyed with substantial loss of personnel and materiel. The tracks themselves were so badly damaged they could not be readily repaired. Many stranded trains were subsequently captured by advancing Red Army forces. Against airfields, particularly those close to the front lines without extensive anti-aircraft defenses, the IL-2 excelled. In late June 1942, a Sturmovik flight led by Vasily Emelianenko attacked a German-held airfield near Artemovsk in eastern Ukraine. The IL-2s flew low up a deep ravine to avoid detection, then rose above a hill to find 2 rows of German bombers lined up on the airfield. The Sturmoviks fired salvos of rockets into the parked aircraft, then raked them with cannon fire. Their wingmen dropped phosphorus incendiaries that spread flames across the field. Multiple aircraft were destroyed before German defenses could respond. Against infantry and fortifications, the IL-2 provided critical close air support. Soviet ground forces, attacking German defensive positions, could call for Sturmovik support with reasonable confidence that the aircraft would arrive and deliver accurate fire. The IL-2 was stable enough to aim precisely, tough enough to fly through light anti-aircraft fire, and carried sufficient ammunition to make multiple attack runs. Individual pilots achieved remarkable records. Lieutenant Colonel Nelson Stepanyan, an Armenian pilot, was credited with sinking 13 German ships, scoring 27 air-to-air kills, destroying 5 bridges, and demolishing nearly 700 vehicles. In December 1944, after being hit during a raid over Latvia, Stepanyan deliberately rammed his flaming IL-2 into the deck of a German warship, dying in the attack but ensuring the ship's destruction. Lieutenant Anna Timofeeva Yegorova, born to a peasant family, became squadron commander of the 805th Assault Aviation Regiment. She flew 243 combat missions in her Sturmovik before being shot down by anti-aircraft fire in August 1944. She survived hitting the ground with a partially opened parachute, an impact that would kill most people. She survived German captivity without adequate medical care for her injuries. After liberation, she faced interrogation by Soviet officers who suspected all former prisoners of being Nazi collaborators. She survived that too, living to tell her story. These individual achievements, while remarkable, should not obscure the broader statistical reality. IL-2 losses throughout the war were staggering. Soviet archives record 11,000 IL-2s lost in action during World War II, though some sources estimate the true total at twice that number. Even using the conservative official figure, this means nearly 1/3 of all IL-2s built were destroyed in combat. Loss rates varied throughout the war. In 1941, during the desperate fighting around Moscow, 1 Sturmovik was lost for every 10 combat missions. By 1943, improved tactics, better training, the addition of the rear gunner, and increased fighter escort reduced this to approximately 1 loss per 26 missions. But even this improved rate meant that IL-2 pilots faced extraordinarily high risk. A pilot completing 50 missions, assuming anyone survived that long, had witnessed roughly 2 aircraft from his squadron destroyed. The Soviet response to these losses was characteristically brutal and effective. Build more aircraft, train more pilots, accept the casualties as the price of victory. The Soviet industrial system, relocated beyond the Urals and operating with ruthless efficiency, produced IL-2s at rates that German industry could not match. At the peak of production in 1943, IL-2s comprised 30% of total Soviet air power. Factories operated around the clock, assembly lines, staffed partly by unskilled labor, including women and teenagers, turned out aircraft with minimal refinement but adequate functionality. The design itself facilitated this mass production. The IL-2 used simple construction techniques. The wooden wings and tail could be built without sophisticated metalworking equipment. The armored hull, while requiring precision in critical areas, used riveted construction that could be performed by moderately skilled workers. The AM-38 engine, while not particularly advanced compared to German power plants, was reliable and could be maintained with basic tools. The IL-2's tactical evolution throughout the war demonstrated Soviet ability to learn from combat experience. Early operations saw Sturmoviks attacking individually or in small groups, often without fighter escort, suffering catastrophic losses. By 1943, standard doctrine called for attacks by 8 to 12 aircraft in coordinated formations, with dedicated fighter escort to suppress German interceptors. The circle of death tactic emerged as perhaps the most effective and certainly the most visually distinctive Sturmovik attack method. 8 IL-2s would form a circle over the target area, flying at low altitude in a continuous orbit. Each aircraft would peel off in succession, dive toward the target, deliver its weapons, then climb back to rejoin the circle. The remaining aircraft in the circle provided covering fire with their rear-facing machine guns, creating a defensive wheel of interlocking fire. German fighters attempting to attack any individual Sturmovik would be engaged by multiple rear gunners simultaneously. The tactic was developed by General Ryazanov, who was later made a Gold Star hero of the Soviet Union for this innovation. In one documented instance, pilots using the Circle of Death claimed to have destroyed more than 70 German tanks in less than 20 minutes. While this specific claim, like most kill claims, was almost certainly exaggerated, the tactic demonstrably improved survival rates and attack effectiveness. Against German fighters, the IL-2 had no chance in traditional dogfighting. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fof-190 could outrun, outclimb, and outmaneuver the Sturmovik with ease. But IL-2 pilots developed defensive tactics that exploited their aircraft's unique characteristics. When a German fighter positioned for an attack, the Sturmovik pilot would reduce power drastically, causing the attacker to overshoot. If the German pilot failed to anticipate this sudden deceleration, he might fly directly in front of the Sturmovik, presenting a perfect target for the IL-2's forward-firing cannons. Against slower German aircraft, particularly bombers, transports, and reconnaissance planes, the IL-2 could be offensively employed as a fighter. While hopeless against dedicated fighters, the Sturmovik proved deadly against Junkers 52 transports, Heinkel 111 bombers when caught without escort, and Henschel 126 reconnaissance aircraft. The 33rd Guards Assault Aviation Regiment was particularly successful in these operations during winter 1941 and 1942. Units operating near Stalingrad in 1942 and 1943 engaged not only Junkers 52s, but also Fokker-Wulf, 200 Condor bombers attempting to deliver supplies to besieged German troops. The IL-2's contribution to Soviet victory was ultimately one of attrition. Not through technological superiority, the aircraft was inferior to most German types in speed, climb rate, and maneuverability. Not through devastating kill ratios, the actual damage inflicted was less than wartime propaganda suggested, but through sheer material weight, through the relentless presence of hundreds of aircraft attacking German forces every day across a front stretching thousands of kilometers. Through the psychological burden imposed on German troops who knew that Soviet aircraft could appear at any moment, German soldiers coined multiple nicknames for the IL-2, each reflecting a different aspect of the threat. Luftwaffe pilots called it the flying tank or concrete plane, acknowledging its durability. They also called it Iron Gustav, perhaps the closest to affection that German pilots would admit for an enemy aircraft. German infantry and tank crews had less charitable names. The Butcher, for the casualties it inflicted. The Black Death, for the dark paint scheme many IL-2s wore, and for the mortality that followed their appearance. The Black Death nickname, in particular, captures something essential about the IL-2's impact. Medieval plague killed through ubiquity, not through individual dramatic encounters. You could not fight the Black Death. You could not negotiate with it. You could not predict where it would strike. It simply appeared, killed, and moved on, indifferent to courage or tactical skill. The IL-2 operated similarly. German forces could not prevent Sturmovik attacks. They could shoot down individual aircraft, and they did, in large numbers, but more always appeared. The production line fed an endless supply of aircraft and pilots into the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. This was Soviet doctrine made manifest. The Soviet Union could not match German tactical sophistication or the quality of individual German equipment. A Tiger tank, crew for crew, was superior to any Soviet tank until the very end of the war. A Messerschmitt Bf 109, pilot for pilot, was superior to most Soviet fighters. German tactical doctrine, emphasizing combined arms coordination and initiative at junior officer level, was more flexible and effective than rigid Soviet operational methods. But the Soviet Union had three advantages that proved decisive: population, allowing replacement of casualties that would have ended any other nation's ability to fight; industrial capacity, relocated and rebuilt beyond German reach, capable of producing sufficient materiel to replace losses and still maintain numerical superiority; and will, the absolute determination to accept any cost, endure any sacrifice, and continue fighting until victory was achieved. The IL-2 embodied all three advantages. It could be built in vast numbers with limited resources. It could be flown by pilots with minimal training. It could survive damage that would destroy most aircraft. And it could inflict sufficient damage, primarily against logistics and soft targets but occasionally against armor as well, to justify its terrible cost in lives and resources. By 1944, the IL-2 had evolved into its final major variant. The IL-2 Type 3 incorporated aerodynamic refinements, all-metal wings with swept-back outer sections replacing the wooden construction of earlier models, and the 1,770 horsepower AM-38F engine. Some variants mounted 37mm Nudelman-Suranov NS-37 cannons in underwing pods, creating a dedicated anti-tank version designated IL-2 NS-37. These aircraft sacrificed rocket capability and reduced bomb load to carry the massive cannons, each weighing over 300 pounds and carrying 50 rounds of ammunition. The NS-37 could penetrate the side and rear armor of any German tank in service. Armor-piercing rounds could defeat up to 100 millimeters of armor at close range, but the massive recoil made accurate fire difficult, and pilots found that multiple hits were usually required to destroy a heavy tank. The NS-37 variant was produced in limited numbers, approximately 1,000 aircraft, before production ceased at the end of 1943. The combination of PTAB bomblets for tanks and 23mm cannons for soft targets proved more versatile and effective. Production of the IL-2 itself ended in late 1944 as resources shifted to the IL-10, an improved Sturmovik with better performance and lighter construction. The IL-10 first entered service in late 1944 and saw action in the final months of the war. It would continue serving in Soviet and Allied air forces into the 1950s, with North Korean IL-10s playing a major role in the opening weeks of the Korean War before U.S. air superiority forced their withdrawal from frontline operations. The IL-2's final operations in World War II came during the massive Soviet offensives of 1945. Sturmoviks participated in the Vistula-Oder offensive, the Battle of the Silo Heights, and the final assault on Berlin. By this stage of the war, German anti-aircraft defenses had been depleted by years of attrition. Luftwaffe fighter opposition was minimal, with most experienced pilots dead and fuel shortages grounding much of the remaining German air force. IL-2s operated with relative impunity, attacking the last German defenders with the same low-altitude tactics that had been refined over 4 years of combat. The final accounting is sobering. Over 36,000 IL-2s were produced during the war. At least 11,000 were destroyed in combat, possibly twice that number. Tens of thousands of pilots and rear gunners died flying an aircraft that was obsolete by the standards of modern air warfare before it even entered service. The IL-2 was slow, poorly armed by the standards of contemporary aircraft, and suffered from fundamental design compromises that made high losses inevitable. Yet it worked, not through elegance, not through technological superiority, but through the brute application of industrial might and human sacrifice. The IL-2 represented Soviet military philosophy in its purest form. Identify the mission, design equipment adequate to accomplish the mission, produce that equipment in overwhelming quantities, train crews to minimum competency, accept catastrophic losses as the price of victory, continue until the enemy is destroyed. This approach required a society willing to accept costs that democratic nations could not sustain. It required industrial mobilization on a scale that only total war could justify. It required leadership willing to threaten factory managers with execution for failing to meet production quotas. It required pilots willing to fly an aircraft that offered armor protection in front, but death from behind. It required a population that would continue fighting after losses that would have broken any other nation. The IL-2 Sturmovik did not win the war on the Eastern Front through devastating effectiveness. It won through persistence, through ubiquity, through the simple fact that no matter how many German fighters shot down Sturmoviks, more appeared the next day. The Black Death nickname was apt not because individual IL-2s were particularly deadly, though they could be, but because they were inescapable. German forces on the Eastern Front faced a terrible calculus. Every day, Soviet artillery would pulverize their positions. Every day, Soviet tanks would probe for weaknesses. Every day, Soviet infantry would assault in numbers that seemed inexhaustible. And every day, Soviet aircraft would appear at low altitude, flying through anti-aircraft fire that should have destroyed them, delivering weapons that killed and destroyed and then disappeared, only to return hours later. The IL-2 was one component of this relentless pressure. Not the decisive component. Ground combat killed far more Germans than air power ever did, but a persistent, demoralizing, inescapable component that contributed to the psychological collapse of German forces who realized they were fighting an enemy that could not be defeated by tactical superiority alone. When the war ended in May 1945, the IL-2 had earned its place in history as the most produced military aircraft ever built. No other combat aircraft has matched its production, total. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 came close, with over 33,000 built, but did not surpass it. Post-war civilian aircraft like the Cessna 172 would eventually exceed the IL-2's production numbers, but no military combat aircraft ever has. This production record reflects the aircraft's fundamental characteristics. It could be mass-produced with limited resources. It could be operated from rough airfields close to the front lines. It could survive damage that would destroy more sophisticated aircraft. And it could accomplish its mission, attacking ground targets at low altitude, despite suffering losses that would have ended any other aircraft's operational career. The legacy of the IL-2 Sturmovik extends beyond its wartime service. The concept of an armored ground attack aircraft, flying low and slow to deliver precise fire support for ground forces, influenced post-war aircraft design. The United States Air Force developed the A-10 Thunderbolt II in the 1970s, an aircraft that shares the IL-2's philosophy of heavy armor, powerful guns, and acceptance of the ground attack role's inherent dangers. The Soviet Union itself did not produce a true IL-2 successor until the Su-25 Frogfoot in the late 1970s, an aircraft that continues seeing combat around the world today. The human cost of the IL-2's operations deserves final consideration. 11,000 aircraft lost in combat means at least 11,000 pilots killed or captured, along with thousands of rear gunners in the two-seat variants. Exact casualty figures are difficult to establish, Soviet records being incomplete and often deliberately obscured, but conservative estimates suggest over 15,000 airmen died flying Sturmoviks during the war. Each of those deaths was an individual tragedy. Each pilot who climbed into an IL-2's cockpit, knowing that 1 in 10 missions ended in death, or 1 in 26 in later years when tactics improved, demonstrated courage that modern observers can barely comprehend. These were not volunteers flying from a sense of adventure. These were Soviet citizens, many conscripted, flying because Stalin demanded it and because the alternative was execution for desertion. Some, like Nelson Stepanyan and Anna Timofeyeva Yegorova, achieved recognition. Most died anonymously, their aircraft crashing in flames over Ukrainian steppes or Belarusian forests, their names recorded in unit logs that were lost or destroyed, their families receiving terse notifications that their son or husband had died serving the motherland. The IL-2 Sturmovik was not a beautiful aircraft. It was not an elegant solution to the ground attack problem. It was not even particularly effective by objective measures of enemy vehicles destroyed per sortie. But it was what the Soviet Union needed, and more importantly, it was what the Soviet Union could build, operate, and sustain through 4 years of the most savage warfare in human history. The Black Death flew because the Soviet Union's industrial might and willingness to accept casualties created a weapon that could not be defeated by tactical skill or technological superiority. It flew because thousands of pilots climbed into poorly protected cockpits and attacked targets at altitudes where every weapon could reach them. It flew because Stalin threatened factory managers with execution if they did not produce more. It flew because the alternative was allowing Nazi Germany to win the war. History offers few simple moral lessons. The IL-2 Sturmovik represents Soviet strengths and Soviet cruelties in equal measure. It demonstrates that wars can be won through material weight and acceptable casualties, rather than through technological excellence. It shows that courage exists even in circumstances where death is statistically probable. It reminds us that victory in total war requires mobilization of every resource, human and material, and acceptance of costs that peacetime societies cannot imagine. The German soldiers who called it the Black Death understood these truths. They could not stop the IL-2s from coming. They could shoot them down, and they did, but more always appeared. The aircraft itself was vulnerable, slow, poorly armed for air combat, but the system that produced it, the industrial capacity and human resources and political will, that system was invincible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.